Good evening. My name is Stanley Bill. I'm the lecturer in Polish Studies at University of Cambridge. So it's a very exciting time for Polish studies in the UK. And I'm very excited to be here, and I thank Agnieszka and Mikołaj for the invitation. And it's great that we are working together as we should be and must in this new exciting circumstance of the last few years. Long may it continue. This evening we're here to talk about a very interesting comparative context, I could say. Two of the most important writers, respectively, of English, two of them and Polish literature, two of the most important figures of English and Polish culture from the first half of the 20th century. We're going to talk about their lives, their writing, but above all, about their lives in translation. Because I have here, seated to my right, two of the eminent translators of English literature into Polish, or English language literature into Polish, and Polish literature into English. So, without any further ado, I would introduce the stars of the conversation. I'll keep out of things as much as I can. First of all, Magda Heydel, who is associate professor in the Faculty of Polish Studies at the Jagiellonian University, and she is both a theorist and practitioner of literary translation. Just to name a few of the works that she's translated into Polish, and I think we should, I suppose, start with Woolf. She's translated 7 books, I believe, by Woolf, or published 7 books of translated works by Woolf, including most recently, came out on November 5th, is that right, this year? Yeah. A collection of Woolf's essays. But apart from that, she's translated Between the Acts, which I've just said is my favourite work by Woolf, in fact, collected short stories, Night and Day, among others. She has also done an outstanding translation of Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, published by Znak in Poland a few years ago. A very interesting project, translating the work of a Polish writer writing in his non-native language, English, with a few Polish idiosyncrasies that creep in, back into Polish. So for the 5th time. For the 5th time, there we are. And she's also, in her capacity as a theorist of translation, written about Miłosz and Eliot as translators. Or Miłosz in particular,
Miłosz
as a translator.
Yeah. And Eliot as a translator's poet.
As a translator's poet. So, could you please welcome Magda Heydel?
Thank you.
And at the end of the table there, Ursula Phillips, whose name you may have heard recently in a very important context, as the winner of the prize for Best Translation of Polish literature into English, for her translation of Szuka, which is here, by the author we're discussing today, Zofia Nałkowska. A prestigious award and recognition also of Ursula Phillips's broader contributions to the translation of Polish literature into English, which, as a teacher of Polish literature, which sometimes requires the presentation of works in translation, I am very grateful for, and I know a lot of other lecturers at other universities across the world. I was talking to many of them in Philadelphia recently at the main conference of Slavic and East European Studies in the United States, and everyone's very excited to hear about what you're doing. And I'd like to take the opportunity to thank you for that on behalf of all the teachers of Polish literature outside Poland.
Around the world.
Very, very important. But Ursula is not just a translator of Nałkowska, and I should mention that apart from Szuka, she has translated Granica, possibly still the best known work by Nałkowska in Poland, and that will be coming out soon, also with Northern Illinois University Press. She's also translated The Heathen by Narcyza Żmichowska, Malwina by Maria Wertymburska, and she's the editor of a collected volume entitled Polish Literature in Transformation, about how Polish literature has changed or not changed after 1989. So please join me in welcoming Ursula Phillips. I'm going to start with a rather difficult question, which is, we need to, perhaps for some members of the audience, introduce Zofia Nałkowska, her life in literature and outside literature. So I'd like to ask Ursula to do that, but I've asked her to do it in a particular way, which is to frame that introduction of Zofia Nałkowska through her own experience as a translator. What was it in particular about Nałkowska's writing, or perhaps her life and personality, that drew you to her? So if you could try to bring us into Nałkowska's life through your own interest as a translator.
Okay. Well, I suppose it started with my, work on the history of Polish women's writing, and the realisation that if I was going to make any impact with this scholarship, there needed to be translations, because otherwise the books couldn't be read. And so this, I had an enormous list of texts that I was going to do, very ambitious list. And the first edition of Malwina, which was a novel originally written in 1816, when it first came out in translation, it ambitiously had on the back of the title page, number 1 in a series of Polish women in English translation. And of course, number 2 never appeared in that particular. But after that, I decided to do the Żmichowska. But a writer that's always fascinated me has been Zofia Nałkowska, and I think because she's closer to us in time. She was very well known and a very important figure in Poland in the interwar years. And, I gradually started to read through all her novels. I mean, I started, I think, with Granica, and then I went back to the earlier ones. And I realised that, she was interesting as a person, not just as a writer, because she changes quite dramatically from the earlier period, through the 20s and 30s. And I suppose, like with any writer that you want to translate, I had a certain feeling of identity with it, yeah? And I believe that other people would also feel this were I to translate her. So it was, it's purely subjective. It was partly the desire to bring good Polish writing by women to a wider audience, but it was also a personal mission, I suppose, for a writer that I identified with. So maybe I should say a little bit about, Zofia was born in 1884. She died in 1954. So, there was no such place as Poland on the political map for the earlier part of her life. She was born and brought up initially in Warsaw, but she travelled a lot. Her father was a very important cultural figure, Wacław Nałkowski. He was a geographer, but a philosopher, and also somebody that was very active in the new Young Poland movement. Yeah, and this sort of Young Poland, you could sort of draw a parallel with the sort of Young Germany, Young France. There were various young movements across Europe at the turn of the century, which was reacting against, in literature, against realism, against social realism, against preaching in literature, and a sort of return to a more imaginative kind of literature, to symbolism, to experimentation with language. And, so this was the sort of background out of which she came. So she was well positioned when she was very young to actually publish. Yeah, she was amongst the right kind of people. So, it's in some ways not surprising that she became a writer. She kept a diary from a very early age, from about the age of 12, 13. And of course we have the hindsight of that now, and we can see her work and the development of her life in the context of the diary, which people didn't know about until the 70s, till 1970s, when they started to be published, and they were published over the next 30 years gradually. So, you know, this is a sort of advantage I think that we have now in understanding her, and we see that, you know, she was a much more complex person than she might have appeared.
How did she appear? What was her image?
Okay. In her early work, and I would say from novel, she started publishing novels from 1906. Her first novel was called Kobiety, Women. And when we talk about feminism, I will return to that. Up until her experience of the First World War, she was very much part of this young Poland experimental type of imaginative literature. She wrote in a specific style which she created. Yeah, she was reacting against realism. Yes, and this sort of went alongside an attempt to create herself as a new woman. This was the age of new ideas about women, rather romanticised and in some ways misogynistic, which came out of, you know, philosophy of Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, and other people that she was reading at the time, Bergson, that she was reading at the time. So she was creating herself in her writing. She was creating a new woman, and it was a woman who was sexually and emotionally fully developed, and this was what she was aiming to do. But this all rather proved, I think in her case, rather sterile after a while, and her writing underwent a fundamental change during the First World War, particularly from about 1915, when the Central Powers occupied Warsaw. There was bombing, and she saw war at first hand. And she says in her diary how she ceased to look inwards at herself. She ceased to think about herself. She looked outwards and to reflect the world and how she perceived the world. And one thing that I think from then on remains with her is this enormous sympathy, I would say even empathy, with suffering. You know, she saw at first hand wounded soldiers and people suffering from, you know, having their houses bombed, and, you know, she really took this in a sort of personal way. And we first see the change with a series of short stories that she published in 1917 called Tajemnice krwi, Secrets of the Blood, which, you know, were, some of them had images of the war, but others were debate about war itself, and we can come back to that theme as well. She developed her own sort of idea about what war was, and she saw it not as something that just came from outside, from the Germans or from the Russians, but it was part of human destiny. You know, the potential for war and for evil was in us. And, you know, this was something I think that remains with her throughout her writing. And then during the 20s, during the 1920s and 30s, she was living in the Kraków for a time in the east. She, as the wife of the chief of police of Grodno, who was a former legionary of Pilsudski, whom she had met during those war years. So she witnessed at first hand the mechanisms of the new state, the new independent Polish state that was born after the First World War. So all through the 20s and 30s, when she'd moved back to Warsaw, you could read her writing not only as personal stories or individual stories about love and personal relationships, but also, I think, as a kind of critique of that new state. Yeah? If anybody's interested, I'm going to be giving a talk about this to the Puno in Polsk in February, about looking at her as a political writer, yeah, because you could see that as another side to her writing. that she shows through the characters and events of her novels what is going on in this new state. She doesn't call it Poland, but we can assume that it's Poland. Then, of course, she lived through the whole of the Second World War in Warsaw. She survived the German occupation. She was a witness to a lot of things that took place, including the Warsaw Uprising, the ghetto destruction, and she lived to see the founding of communist power. And interestingly, she was one of these people that decided to go along with it, who decided to go. She was never a member of the Communist Party, but she was somebody that played her part in reviving cultural life after the war. And she had various public roles, which we can again come back to. She died in 1954. But one other thing I should mention is that after the war, because she was a well-known public intellectual and writer before the war, she was one of the people that was chosen to be on the official government commission into researching Nazi crimes. And she saw she was part of this research commission, and out of that experience came the very famous short stories, novellas, called Medallions. Yeah. Okay, I'll stop there because I think I said probably too much.
a heroic act of.
But there are lots of gaps
biographical
in that.
concision.
Yes.
I'd like to ask Magda now. I wouldn't want to assume necessarily that Virginia Woolf is more familiar to our audience this evening. Who knows? But perhaps you could give...
I don't think I have really to present Virginia Woolf as a writer to you.
Perhaps
today,
some Polish perceptions
of
Virginia Woolf.
I just wanted to add that this morning I went to bookshops in Oxford Main Street, and there is hundreds of gadgets with Virginia Woolf. Bag with Virginia Woolf, Virginia Woolf bag, Virginia Woolf mag, Virginia Woolf t-shirt, Virginia Woolf everything. So that's why I'm so happy that I have a Nałkowska t-shirt rather than Virginia Woolf t-shirt here with me. And I actually made a point of asking the man at the counter whether they had anything by Nałkowska. Mm-hmm. And he had difficulties with typing the name and typing the titles, and he couldn't find anything. And said, "No, we can order things for you, but unfortunately, I'm sorry, there's nothing at the moment in stock." So, yes. So I was very sorry to hear that, but I think it's much more worthwhile to speak about Nałkowska than about Woolf. So, if you ask me about Woolf from the Polish perspective, I start with myself. I started working on Woolf in 2005, so I'm a late translator. Much has been done before, and I came in the era, in the post Michael Cunningham era, right? So Woolf became this icon of pop culture after the film The Hours, and everybody wanted to read Woolf suddenly. So that's why the first, so she was kind of revived by the popular culture, and I think this is something that popular culture should be really given credit to. So this was why I was asked whether I would like to translate the shortened version of the diary, which is called A Moment's Liberty, and it's 600 pages long, but just one volume. And this was the way in which I discovered Woolf, first as a person, and I was shocked to see what a rich personality and what a wonderful life this was, rather than being just a stereotypical, mad woman suffering somewhere. I discovered somebody with so much to say on all sorts of topics, with so many friends in all sorts of social milieus, and with so many keen interests. So that's why I was so happy to be able to translate and publish translations of her other stuff. But as I say, I'm a late translator, and her translation started in the 1960s in Poland. Although already in the 1930s there were mentions of her name in articles about British modernist literature. So she was mentioned in one of the minor modernist writers, or she was very often compared to James Joyce. So there was this idea that they were both experimental writers, but Joyce, of course, the big male figure, was the dominant one, and Woolf was compared to him usually as the imitator or somebody who, completely untrue, who did similar things that Joyce did. Interesting thing that you might like to know is that in 1939, in August, Wanda Meltzer, a Polish poet and writer, gave a talk on Virginia Woolf in Polish Academy of Literature. And then in 1939, as you know, in September, the war broke, and this lecture didn't survive. I mean, we know about it only from somebody else's record of this occasion, but it was not published. It had to be published in Wiadomości Literackie, but never was. So Woolf comes to Poland in 1960s, and she's read as, and also this is interesting, that the first novel to be translated is The Years. In 1958, The Years were translated by somebody called Małgorzata Schercha, and I tried to find out who she was, and the only thing I was able to find out is that she was the co-author of the Polish-English dictionary with Jan Stanisławski, so she was probably not a literary figure at all. I don't know, I hope to find out why she translated this very novel and why anybody, saw this as the first thing of Woolf's to be presented to Polish audience. But then in 1961, Mrs. Dalloway was published, and in 62 To the Lighthouse, and these translations were done by Krystyna Tarnowska, an eminent translator. And these translations were republished later on, and they are the canonical translations of these two great novels. My very private dream is to translate Mrs. Dalloway anew, but, well, who knows what happens. Then another important date is 1977, where the first collection of Woolf's essays was published, and it's called The Leaning Tower, Pochyła Wieża, and was put together by Ewa Życieńska and Aleksandra Ambros. And it's a beautiful, wonderful collection of 36 essays, very rich. But all these appearances or images of Woolf in translations and in criticism are of a intellectual or of a modernist. There is no women context for Woolf in this period. So she is discussed as somebody who is an experimental writer, who is very sophisticated, who is very difficult, very strange, something completely new to Polish writing, this kind of thing. A lot of reviews saying that it's incomprehensible, it's not necessary, it's something that the working people of Poland don't really care for. But also some very enthusiastic reviews. So this was the first wave of Woolf's presence in Poland. Then there are, in the 80s, there is a collection of essays, or series of essays by Maria Niemojowska on Virginia Woolf. Maria Niemojowska, who lived in London and was a translator and intellectual. So she was trying to show Woolf from a different perspective, not from the perspective of the working people of Poland, but in a more informed way. And then one more very important date, 1981, when Wiesław Juszczak, an art historian, publishes his very interesting essay called Zasłona w rajskie ptaki, curtain with birds of paradise, which is an analysis or interpretation of Mrs. Dalloway in Tarnowska's translation, where he says that this novel, in fact, is about living as creation. So it's about creation of a work of art. The party Mrs. Dalloway is throwing is a work of art, and the moment when the curtain with the birds of paradise is blown into the room is the moment of the complete success of this work of art, of this, the moment where we enter into this other sphere. Juszczak, who is a specialist in ancient Greece and in the concept of art as an emanation of deity, neglected completely anything that had to do with the image of life of people, or history, or London, or the war, the First World War, anything like that. I mean, all this was kind of moved away from what he was looking at. He was looking at this novel about creation of art. And then, in the 1990s, the feminist part of reception of Woolf started in Poland, but perhaps we can talk about that later.
Well, actually, we'll certainly move on to that as a very important part of the discussion. But before I go back to Ursula, I thought I would ask you to characterize how Woolf's style is constructed and how you went about rendering it into Polish.
All right. Okay.
We want to hear about translation. You have two wonderful translators next. How do you do it? It's a good start.
Yeah, I think Woolf's style is something very difficult to grasp in a short introduction, because, in fact, every book she produced showed a different possibility of style of writing. So I think that every book, every novel she wrote was a new experiment. It was not the kind of writing that discovered the style and then just used it. I think what bothered the reviewers at the beginning of the reception of Virginia Woolf in Poland was its non-realistic aspect. But I don't want to say that this is a non-realistic writing or non-realist writing, because she's very careful to give details of everyday life, to give images of people, of places, of landscapes. So I think she's very much into the mimetic possibility of language. But what she does is she experiments with time, with perspective, with the point of view. And this was not something that was, everyday ideas in socialist prose. All right, so that's why I'm referring, but now and again to the context, the kind of historical or cultural context into which Woolf entered. But she was seen as different from what was being written then, and thus bourgeois. Or experimental in the sense of this bourgeois art, which is, not a simple recreation of reality, if there is anything like that. If you ask about technicalities, Virginia Woolf means long sentences, and Virginia Woolf means point of view. So what I struggled with and what I tried to be very careful about was to always see who's looking, who's speaking, who's understanding, who's trying to catch the thing that is being there. And also the other thing is I always repeat that my students here will smile, that when I translate I hear voices, and I always read aloud the passages that I've just produced, so very often I have to stop after half a sentence and say, no, that's rubbish, let's do it again. But what I was after was to produce a unified voice for these books that I did, a voice that would be a voice of a living human being. And I think it has to do also with the point of view technique, that it's not an abstract narration coming from somewhere. It always does come from a person. So I don't know if that answers your question at all.
It's fascinating. Well, I think we'll want to come back to it as well. But you brought the image of Woolf coming into 1960s communist Poland. I had this image of Virginia Woolf walking into a bar mleczny, milk bar in Warsaw, a classic communist, simple communist.
Well, you'd be surprised, because intellectuals used to go to eat there. So probably if she really appeared there, she would probably go to that bar.
Thank you very much. Ursula, could you perhaps start with this question of Nałkowska's style, how you tackled it, and then guide us into a history of, it's a little shorter, the history of Nałkowska's
interestingly exists. Okay, well, as I was trying to explain in my long preamble, her style changed quite dramatically when she started to write about the First World War. Now, I have not translated her earlier works. I have not tackled those, where she's writing in a more poetic style, in a very sort of symbolic and, a style. She was trying to create her own kind of language to write about herself in her self-creation, yeah? So I've not actually, tackled those kind of books. I've rather concentrated on the later books. And, once she starts to write about the war and to write about the world around her and write about the, developing new state, she becomes more realistic, I have to say, a lot more realistic. But it's not entirely realism, because in the similar modernist way that Woolf writes, she doesn't have an all-powerful third-person narrator that's sort of telling you what to think. Yeah, the narration tends to move, even whether you've got a sort of assumed third person or a first person in some cases narrator, as in Shuka. The perspective moves all the time, and the perspective is therefore limited. It's rather like a camera, moving and recording and looking at, the world through the eyes of a particular protagonist. So you see their perspective, but you don't see the full perspective, and then it moves to somebody else. And I found that in Granica, which I've just translated, hasn't been published yet, it's about to be published, this was particularly strongly evident. Because I've read, feminist writing, or little feminist writing that exists in Poland about it, that Elżbieta, one of the two main female protagonists, is her porte-parole, so she's using Elżbieta to sort of comment on the others. But, it didn't seem to me like that at all. It seemed, also there were many passages where it was looked at from Pani Kolichowska, the old lady, her aunt, other passages where it was looked at from the point of view of Justyna. And interestingly, and I think this is, to her great credit, also from the point of view of the male protagonist. You saw it, from his. So this was quite a challenge when translating, because the style that you're writing in, or the kind of tone, has to reflect that in some way. Yeah, has to indicate that in some way. And whilst I, was making the point that she became more realistic in these novels, in the sense that she took detail from life rather than from imagination. Even though she did that, she continued to use a very, what I would describe as almost poetic style, because it's so dense, terse, yeah? Not necessarily short sentences, but short images, and very compact language. In Polish it's more compact than English anyway.
Is it?
Well, I think it is. Yeah, because it's built up from verbal nouns, adjectives, verbs. It doesn't have so much. For example, sometimes you need four words in English for a part of the verb. And I find that in Nałkowska's play it's particularly dense, and this was a real challenge for me to get over the tone of the language. As you say, you hear it, the cadences of the sentences, without making them overburdened with words. And I mean, Granica went through 10 versions.
Magda, I see you want to respond to this.
Please.
Yeah, 10 versions before.
By the way, may I just quickly point out that we're going to let the conversation carry on naturally, and then we'll come to all of your questions
but I must talk about
at the end, before too long. So Magda, could you...
No, because I'm shocked with what you said about Polish being more compact than English. I always find it opposite.
Well,
it's not the matter of the number of words, because, of course, in English there's always more words than in Polish, because it's flexive language packs things into longer strings of signs. But actually, this is a private remark. I hope when you come to Kraków, maybe we can have a seminar on that as well.
Yes,
that would
of
be
course.
lovely.
Yes, but interestingly, interestingly, my model, because I mean, I don't follow somebody else's style, I don't follow it, but I always use contemporary writing as inspiration, yeah? And, you know, I chose Woolf, you know, for my inspiration here, because I love the way that her style is very active, you know, it's very active, very energetic. It uses active verbs, and in English writing, this is quite unusual. And you know, we tend to sort of describe things in a long-winded way with a lot of passive voice, whereas, you know, I find her style quite inspirational in that sense.
Just wanted to say, add a remark about the equivalent for styles in Polish and English modernist writing, because Młoda Polska, the young Poland, is often equivalentized, put on equal terms with the British modernism, which is not true at all. I mean, so once Nałkowska, who followed the fashionable style of the turn of the century, liberated herself out of this post-romantic kind of, you know, subjective writing, she went on the same kind of voice wave with British modernists, with Woolf, for example, or Ian Foster, perhaps.
Yeah, because I mean, her aim, I think, was to convey experience. Emotional experience, psychological
but still, I
experience.
think she stayed much more emotional than Woolf ever was.
Yes, I agree with you there. Should I say something just briefly about the history, or we want to get on to feminism?
Well, why don't you very briefly talk about that, and also mention, it seems clear that Woolf did not know Nałkowska's writing. Is that
I tried to make sure about the years, but it's pretty
It's hard to be sure, but there is evidence that Nałkowska was aware of Woolf, so we could present that to us.
Yes, well, I have two entries from her diary from the 1940s, which make it quite clear that she was well aware who Woolf was. But I would also say that with diaries, you know, they are a bit random. But it's very possible that she read, and I suspect that she really did read, a lot more than she actually says in her diary that she read. The first mention is in 1945, when a group of English writers invited by Polish pen came to Kraków. And she mentions Woolf's suicide. And she describes a conversation with a writer that we've more or less forgotten about now, Margaret Storm Jameson. And she says that...
Has anyone heard the name Margaret Storm Jameson?
Anyway, Nałkowska says of her that she is now the greatest of their writers, English ones, following the suicide of Virginia Woolf, which suggests that she thought that until the suicide she thought of Virginia Woolf as the greatest English female writer. And then a year later, when she was in Paris, and of course she spoke French fluently and she had a lot of connections with France. She was in Paris 1946, and she says that she read La Maison Hantée, which is Virginia Woolf's The Haunted House, and she describes it as being unbelievably subtle or delicate. Yeah, that's the translation, of course. And I traced this. This was the translation done by a certain Hélène Bokanowski, published in 1946. So this was translated a couple of years after it appeared in English, after Leonard Woolf published that collection of. So that's evidence that she read her.
The story itself, not the collection, or is it the collection?
Oh, it's the collection, I think.
I think
so.
I think because the story itself is very subtle and poetic.
Well, she has novella in the plural.
Oh, right.
So
okay.
I suspect it is that volume that was translated into French. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So that's Nałkowska's knowledge of Woolf. I have 3 pages of notes about the translations of Nałkowska into English.
Maybe keep it to...
I will keep it very... the first thing that was translated was her first novel, Women, and it was translated, and none of her other full-length novels were published until recently, until a couple of years ago, in fact. So
And what year was it?
this was 1920. It was published in New York and London in a translation by a certain Michael Henry Dziewicki, which I thought was a wonderful name, but somebody was translating a book called Kobiety anyway. But I found no reviews of it. But the research goes on, and it's possible that I will uncover more about this gentleman and the reception of the review. Now, there were several collections in the 1910s and early 1920s by translations by two ladies called Elsa Benecka and Marie Busch, and they did several anthologies, Polish Tales, more Polish Tales, and then in Selected Polish Tales, which was their third volume, we have a story by Nałkowska. And it's one of the stories I was mentioning that she wrote about the First World War. And it's one of the stories also that was very much based on her own experience. And it describes when she goes back from Warsaw to her home, her family home, which was on the other side, on the other bank of the river, and that it had been occupied by Russian soldiers who were retreating after the occupation by the Germans in 1915. And she describes her encounter with a Russian officer who actually helps her pack her books, and he turns out to be quite a nice guy, yeah. And it's called Pour prendre congé. She gives it a French title. And the English only appears in the abbreviated form, PPC, a lady's narrative. So he sort of ratchets up, her social standing. But I just want to read you what Marie Busch says in her preface, because it's quite interesting. Madame Regia Nałkowska, because Regia was the name of her first husband, who with Karten Bondarowski belongs to the youngest group of Polish writers, is a strong feminist of courageous views, this was 1921, and a keen satirist of certain national and social conventions. Well, it's a pretty good summing up of Nałkowska. The present volume only contains a short sketch, a personal experience of hers during the early part of the war. It would be considered a very daring thing for a Polish lady to venture voluntarily into the zone of the Russian army. I thought, wow. Anyway, of course, it's
1921.
Wow.
1921.
Where
right.
was that published again?
London and New York.
That was
Putnam.
London, New York as well. Putnam. Okay.
Oh no, hang on, no, that one. No, No, that one was Oxford University Press. Oxford University Press. Right. I'm rushing on now. The Day of His Return. This was one of her 3 plays. Dzień jego powrotu. The drama w 3 aktach. It was first performed in Warsaw in 1930, but interestingly, it was performed at the Birmingham Repertory Theatre in October 1931. It was translated by a certain Maria Słomczańska, and I found out quite a lot about her, because she was Polish origin, but she was a quite a well-known Polonist in London, active in various émigré circles. She died in 1976. But this was reviewed in the Times. And I quote briefly, "A new play of unusual interest is being presented at the Birmingham Repertory Theatre on Saturday evening. This is The Day of His Return, translated from the Polish of Zofia Nałkowska by Maria Słomczańska. The play is a tragedy, dealing with the psychology of a murderer and his wife's devotion. It has enjoyed a long run in Warsaw and has been played in Germany and Yugoslavia." Okay, so it's a play in which Nałkowska explores one of her themes that she interested her a lot. Where does evil come from? Where does crime come from? Where does war come from? Yeah. So, okay, that's that. That was 31. Then a novella called Macierzyństwo, Motherhood, which was originally published as a separate novella in 1933 and was then incorporated into Granica. It makes up chapter 15 of Granica. And this was translated and published in Polon Littéraire, which is a French journal, but it was published in English by a certain Geoffrey Potocki de Montalk. And those of us that translate Polish know wwho he is because he's the only person to have translated the whole of Dziady into English. Dziady by Mickiewicz, Forefather Dean. Yeah, and it was that translation was published in '68 with an introduction by no less Victor Weintraub. Interestingly, there is no mention of her in an anthology that was edited by Maria Kuntsevich and published in 1963 because Kuntsevich knew Nałkowska quite well. And that was the modern Polish mind. Then, after that, after the war, apart from the inclusion of some translations of her characters, Charaktery, which was a series of interesting character sketches she wrote of real people, based on the same principle as Pascal's characters, apart from those, the only translations of her that have appeared since the war have been from medallions, these Holocaust stories, the whole of which was published in 2000. Yeah, so to the British public and to people studying Polish literature in universities that depend on translations, she is thought of as a writer on the Holocaust, but she was a lot more than that. This was the last thing. There was one exception from this. Again, OUP. It's a passage from Nałkowska's 1918 novel, Count Emil, Hrabia Emil, which was also about the First World War. Yeah, this appeared in the anthology Women's Writing of the First World War, edited by Agnes Cardinal, Dorothy Coldman and Judith Hathaway, published by OUP in 1999. And this includes, the extract included is chapter 32 of Hrabia of Emil, which describes how Emil's manor house is transferred into a field hospital. And again, it really does concentrate, as in those early stories, on the horror, the wounds, quite detailed descriptions of physical suffering, dying, corpses, yeah? And, it's that kind of biological observation as well, which is quite characteristic of her. So, then, of course, we have our own translations. This one, which, won the prize, but there was also last year another translation of Nałkowska, which I should mention because it's a very good one, of a novel that was written about the same time as Szuka, it predates it by a couple of years, called The Romance of Teresa Hennet. And this was done by a team, which is an interesting alternative for translation, somebody of native Polish origin and an American, Megan Thomas and Ewa Malchowska-Pasek. So that has appeared. Then there will be My Granica, and I'm also doing Niecierpliwie now, which was a novel that Nałkowska wrote, published in 1939. So we're now changing this view of her, broadening this view, since she was a lot more than a writer on the Holocaust.
Thank you very much. Fascinating. Both writers are greatly interested in how socially imposed forms deform individual personalities, in fact. In Woolf's case, we know this especially from her writing that has gone down in history as those of an icon of the feminist movement in the West. So I'd like to ask Magda to discuss the image of Woolf's feminism in Poland, perhaps how you understand Woolf's feminism personally. And this is a lot to ask of you, but it's perhaps useful to provide some background at this point on how feminism differs in a Polish context, because there are some significant differences to speak of.
I think it's very important to talk about that, perhaps first of all, because Woolf's writing, translated into Polish in the middle 1990s, was very important for the discussion about feminism as an attitude, as an intellectual position, as an approach to reality, as a challenge to stereotypical thinking about social roles. I think it's important to say that women in Poland after the Second World War were treated in a very special way. feminism was inexistent for two reasons. One of them was the tradition of the Catholic Church, where the traditional roles are very much given to be taken and not discussed and promoted. And this is a very important impact on any kind of social thought and social positions in Poland. And the other is the ideological impact of the socialist times, or the era of communism in Poland, where on the one hand things like feminism were seen as the bourgeois importation from the West, the rotting West. But on the other hand, there was this very strong element in socialist propaganda or socialist ideology about the role of women as citizens and about the ones who are equal to men, in the sense that they can drive tractors, they can work at factories, they can do anything they like. And this image of socialist state as a space where women are really free to pursue their dreams. The reality was dramatically different, because the traditional roles were enforced, and in fact what happened was that women had to fulfill all the traditional roles of mothers, breadwinners, sometimes cleaning ladies, and doing all sorts of jobs that they were not paid for, and on top of that they had to go to the factory to earn money rather than to fulfill their dreams. So in 1990s, when Woolf is translated by Agnieszka Graf, then a young intellectual, already educated in the West, because she studied in the States, with an introduction by Izabela Filipiak, one of the then very young writers of feminist attitude, and a very courageous propagator of feminism. This becomes a beginning of a discussion in Polish humanities, in Polish academia, and among Polish intellectuals, about the role of women as subjects in the sphere of culture. So what happened was that the people like Maria Janion, Kinga Dunin, Ewa Kraskowska later on started writing about women and about feminism as a new way of looking at women in culture, women in society. Not in the aspects of the women's rights, like sexual rights, for example, sexual equality, which was important for Nałkowska, but in the sense of seeing them as legitimate subjects of intellectual exchange, and rediscovering the positions into which women are forced rather than being given a choice. So this was an enormous role of the translation of Room of One's Own, and then it was republished together with the Three Guineas a few years later. Interesting thing is that Izabela Filipiak, writing an introduction to this volume of the single essay, the Room of One's Own, actually uses Woolf's style to give her argument. It's not a linear text, it's a text divided into sections, and each of them is given from a different point of view. And she even incorporates very much Woolf's style narrative into this essayistic text. So she summarizes Woolf's main points, but she also gives this little story about herself visiting a professor, a man, in company of her two male friends. And there is this scene in the garden. They are having very simple meal of boiled potatoes and kwaśne mleko, kind of very simple peasants' food meal. And these potatoes are boiled with the skin on, so you have to very quickly peel it before you eat it. And this professor says, and now Izunia is going to peel the potatoes for us. And she says, well, every everybody's going to peel their own potatoes. And she gives this little story as a kind of joke, but also as a kind of image of the attitude of intellectuals, educated people, cultural people to the position of woman in a social situation. Interestingly, there was a lot of positive reaction to this publication and to this introduction as well. And as I said, it was very important as a starter for discussion of the role of women, also in Polish transformation. But there was one written by a man ridiculing this and saying that, I'm the first who always wants to carry suitcases and open doors before ladies, and now what should I think? This young lady wants to disrupt this wonderful reality we're living in. It's quite telling, I must say, quite telling, and very, very ridiculous, really, but also very funny from today's point of view. But one more remark, perhaps, this discussion about the role of women was important also because of the rethinking of Polish transformation from the point of view of a woman, or of women. Maria Janion, a very important person in Polish intellectual life, and the one who really reintroduced women again to the history of Polish literature as well, and the cultural processes of the 19th and 20th century, said, of course, supporting opposition, I never thought of demanding a special place for women, and now I think it was a mistake. We should never have agreed to have this transformation done for us, by us, but for us, and not in our behalf, but it's really above our heads. And then after the transformation was done, it turns out that we are still in the same place. And it was a mistake, she says, that we have not asked for a special path for women. And in fact, what happened is 20 years after the transformation of 1989, women only started emerging as figures in this process. So she was very right in seeing this inequality in the position of we all fight arm in arm, but in fact it's not exactly the same story for men and for women.
She highlighted also the fact that in the movements from the Solidarity movement onwards throughout the 80s, women were key to the spreading of underground literature and everything. They played an important role in the Solidarity movement, but when the Round Table discussions were taken, there weren't women.
There's a very interesting book I could recommend called Solidarity Secret, which is precisely about the forgotten
what
role.
isn't true, sorry?
We'll come back in question time, but perhaps...
Anyway, that's what Janion said, isn't it?
In fact, because we're running out of time, and I don't think we're going to get even close to exhausting the question of feminism, perhaps we could have some questions in that direction. But in the meantime, Ursula, could you please talk about how you would characterise Nałkowska's feminism and what it means to you? Describe yourself, among many other things, as a British feminist, as a contemporary British feminist. What Nałkowska, a Polish writer who never described herself as a feminist, writing in the 1930s.
She never used the word of herself. She never used the word of herself. And it's interesting.
With the word.
Yes, it was in use. Yes, it was in use. Sorry, you threw me off what I was going to say.
Nałkowska.
Yes, this I think it's salutary to remember that this was the period of Rosa Luxemburg and Alexandra Kollontai, and that there were active feminists in Poland. Yeah, Paulina Kulczewska-Reinschnitt, Maria Tuzima, Kazimiera Budwidowa, Cecilia Walewska, and so on and so on. Some of them who were of the generation older than Nałkowska. So this has been this was a movement that was actually visible and active in Poland. Yeah, so it's important to know that, to understand that how different Nałkowska was, because she didn't have anything to do with that. She was not involved in those kind of movements. And where I could go on. There's a lot of stuff from the diary I could say, but what two things I'll mention. One is I'll return to Kobiety, the novel, in a minute, but the most important thing to know is the speech that she made in 1907 to the first Congress of Polish Women, which was basically featuring that older generation. They were fighting for civil, citizens' rights. They were for rights in the workplace, education. These kind of changes to the divorce laws, family laws, this kind of thing. They were fighting for these kind of things. Whereas Nałkowska placed herself in contrast to them as a representative of the younger generation. But, even though she did that, she probably spoke largely for herself. This speech was called Remarks on the Ethical Tasks of the Women's Movement, and it was published that same year in the journal Krytyka. The watchword, or the watchphrase of it was, we want the whole of life. My chcemy całego życia. And what she was referring to was sexual fulfillment. The essence of it is a rebellion against the double standard, as she saw it, and demand for women's sexual liberation on the same terms as men. So this is a theme that runs through a lot of her writing, that the double standard, that men could do what they want and get away with it, could do what they wanted, but a woman always had to be virtuous, women weren't free to behave as they wished, and they were certainly not really even free to talk about sex. So this was really the basis of her, what she called love, the fullness of love. It wasn't just about family and being married and about romantic love. It was about being sexually fulfilled, and this fits in with her, what I would describe her almost biological approach to life, and the understanding that human psychology is largely determined by biology. And that's, her theories about war come out of that as well. Now, at the same time that she criticised the double standard, she also attacked society in general for expecting women to be virtuous, and she also attacked these virtuous feminists by making a case for prostitution and for defending prostitutes, because she showed that the virtue of middle class and upper class women really depend on the existence of prostitution, on the degradation of other women, because men had to have them. So basically, this speech was a call for all women to unite against the common enemy, not men, but this society that allowed men sexual freedom that was denied to the rest. So, this was the kind of thing that she wrote. Now, as I was talking before about her she was developing her own femininity. I mean, she was very much a woman. She perceived herself as a woman, and it was her full development as a human being and a woman that she wanted to emphasise. And if I might just read you just a small bit from her diary, because it's indicative. It's just a quote, very brief one. A man may know the fullness of life, because in him dwells both the man and the human being. For a woman is left only a fraction of that life. She has to be either a human being or a woman. She is never a perfect creature. So now the moment is approaching when I must choose. That is, whether to remain a cripple and halt the development of half my being. Now, this sounds like, if you translate this into the 1980s or 90s, this sounds like making a case for difference feminism, But women and men are in some way essentially different. So this is a very, very different kind of feminism that was being put forward by these more socialist and socially minded feminists at the time. And it's interesting that in Kobiety, she actually has a satirical portrait, I would say a parody of a contemporary feminist, because she read all this stuff, she knew what they were saying, and we have a character there who is, as I say, a parody, who's a woman, she's very thin, she's unattractive, she wears glasses, you know, she's got horrible hair, you know, and she's just unpleasant generally, yeah? And, you know, this is how...
There's
you know,
something wrong with her.
there's something wrong with her, yeah. So in contrast to, you know, the young women that were building up their sexuality and their personalities and wanting to be intellectuals and fully sexually, you know, liberated at the same time, we have these rather creepy little feminists.
Well,
So I'm going to stop.
Maybe we'll let Magda have one very brief response, no more than a minute, and then sorry, but we're out of time, and we really need to open. We really need to open to the floor.
Because we were talking before this discussion about avoiding calling Nałkowska a Polish wolf, and I am also avoiding this very much. But there is a lot of parallels or a lot of kind of common moments. And they are very interesting to discuss, really. They are not obvious. So if you think about Night and Day, one of the early novels by Virginia Woolf, where she discusses the moment of choice, what to do. A young woman has to decide what to do in life. And there is also this Mary Datchet, who is one of the most main protagonists, and there is something wrong with her. Okay, she is this feminist activist, and she does wonderful things, but there's no way in which she could make a happy relationship. She's in love with this guy, but he chooses this other woman who is busy pouring tea at 5 o'clock, and you know. All this kind of thing, but also another thing that we hope to be able to discuss, but there's no time, is the relationship
responses to questions we can discuss.
The sexuality and the bodily in Nałkowska as opposed to Woolf. Woolf is very much into seeing a woman like as an intellectual creature and a spiritual creature, not a bodily one. So there is a lot to be said about the way she avoids discussing the body. She's in the diary. There are, for example, entries when she is disgusted by her young guests who are so very much enjoying food. They are biting into this meat, and it's disgusting for her. So there is much to talk about here, but there's one more. I'm so stressed that I can't remember now what I wanted to say.
Why don't you collect your thoughts while we just open, because I think I really do want to include everyone that's come along here today. So perhaps to begin with, if you could just have a little show of hands so I get a sense of how many questions we might have, if there are people who would like to. We also have a special contribution from the front here. So let's see a question here, over there. Well, some hands will go up soon, but the first gentleman earlier on raised his hand, so go ahead. By the way, could everyone please introduce themselves very briefly before the question?
Brief questions.
Peter Werner, Model College. I am totally disturbed by your demagoguery.
My demagoguery?
Yes, but I think you have no conception of Polish history at all when you say that in 30s, Wasilewska, etc., they were emancipated. They were communist ideologies.
I'm sorry, I'm talking about the 1890s. I'm talking...
You mentioned that.
1890s.
Yes. No. Well, okay, later like is Luxembourg and Wasilewska.
Yeah, they were all dead by then. They were died in the 20s,
I don't think Polish women needed any emancipation from the West. They were. Have you heard about the poetess Jastrzębska?
Yes, I have. Yes.
She's the greatest, I think.
Okay, fine.
All emancipation she wrote. Secondly, I thought. I'm very glad.
Last question.
Translating. Now, look, you're a Cambridge chap. You must leave some time for.
That's right, but we have other people in the room as well. So just if you could keep it brief and finish up.
Now, this is a discussion here. Secondly, I'm most welcome that you are translating Nałkowska. Most welcome. But why is it, if you are trying to propagate Polish literature, how come Dąbrowska is totally ignored in Anglo-Saxon literature? Why are you so obsessed by one person?
I'm not obsessed
You
by
are,
interest.
incidentally, you are.
Okay,
I'm sorry, I object
thank
to
you very
that.
much for your questions. Thank you very much. Well, we do want to have time for others. So,
shall I
if you
answer
could
this?
just respond very briefly, if you feel the need.
Well, I'm sorry, but I mean, I've studied Poland for over 30 years, so to say I don't know anything about Polish history, I'm afraid is a bit off. But I mean, the people I was talking about, the feminists I was talking about, contemporary with the young Nałkowska, were a generation older than her. I was talking about the 1890s, so it's got nothing to do with communism, nothing to do with the communist period. I mean, if I had time, I would translate Dąbrowska. If I had time, I would translate Orzeszkowa. There's only so much that one individual can do. I mean, I'm an admirer of Nocy Jedynie, if that's the novel you're referring to. Great, it would be wonderful if somebody could translate that. Yeah.
We invite you to translate Dąbrowska into English. Are there other questions? There was a question at the front here.
Yeah, it's a completely different topic. So I read Szuka in Polish, and I was so we were supposed to introduce ourselves. So I study here. It's my 5th year here. I study modern languages, mostly German.
Yes.
And one of my favorite writers is Thomas Mann.
Yes.
And of course,
yes.
if you know the Magic Mountain, then he read Szuka, which she started writing a year after the publication of Magic Mountain. I think. So he published 24, so she started writing in 2025, right? So the similarities are astonishing. But then I've heard that she didn't know the Magic Mountain.
I deal with this topic in my introduction.
Do you? Then
Yes.
I must read it.
I researched this to some extent because I thought, well, there must be some connection here. But she didn't easily read German. She did read German, she didn't easily read it. And it wasn't translated into Polish till a lot later. So she wouldn't have read it in Polish. It wasn't translated into English until 1928. Now, it was published I think it was in November 1924. She was in Lausanne, Poland, Lausanne, Switzerland, which is the inspiration, from February to April 1925. So I think it's unlikely that she did know it. I think it's because they were in similar places, in sanatoria, they met similar type of people, representatives of all the nations, that it turned out to be a sort of similar work. But it's interesting that she met Mann in 1927, because Mann came to Poland, again on one of these pen, jamborees, and she wrote a little article. I mean, I talk about it there. A little article about him in Wiadomości, but she never ever mentions Szuka. So I mean, I think she was embarrassed or didn't want to draw attention to the fact that it was similar.
Oh, I see.
I don't know, but it's very interesting that she never mentions that connection. But I don't think she nicked it, if you see what I mean. If she didn't, I don't think she was influenced by Mann when she wrote that. I think it just happened, by chance. So.
Very intriguing.
Yeah.
Before we come to Teresa Halikowska-Smith, is it young fellow?
Yes,
Yes.
young fellow. I've wanted to ask Ursula a question. You stressed the importance of diary writing to Nałkowska as a genre.
Yes.
Would you agree with the view that her sort of liking of this genre informed the style of Szuka and later writing it? Would that have a certain influence on how you translated it, if you like? And I was also going to ask Magda one question, because in particular what you said about Tarnowska's translations of Stanley and The Lighthouse, as it were, and that one day you might propose a new translation. I'd be intrigued to learn what you would do differently.
Why don't we start with Magda? Is that okay? We start with Magda?
I don't know exactly yet, but her translation, especially Mrs. Dalloway, to my ear reads differently from what I hear as voice of Virginia, the imagined voice of Virginia Woolf. The voice of Virginia Woolf I kind of produced for myself and for the readers. And I think Tarnowska does sometimes I think she introduces this concept of a narration from above the presented world, while Mrs. Dalloway is very, very precise in showing that each sentence has a point of view and a direction. There are short stories by Woolf where she speaks about the little arrows that are thrown away from people's mouths when they talk. So there's, this image of 4 people in the dark garden sitting, and there are only those arrows being sent from one to another. So I think Mrs. Dalloway is exactly about that. I mean, done by this technique. So I think I would try to make it more subtle this way. And also, there are different voices in this novel, and I guess it would. I've tried to separate them from one another. I try to make them different, make them feel a kind of different quality. Septimus Smith, for example, from Mrs. Dalloway. I guess I concentrate on that. And also there is the thing that Wiesław Juszczak in his essay on Mrs. Dalloway makes a big deal of. I don't think it's so important, but it made me think. The last image of Mrs. Dalloway showing up on the party, there she was. What does it really mean? Does it mean there was this woman who entered this room, or does it mean there she was as this fulfillment of this creative art and this creator entering its own creation, whether it has this kind of more metaphysical meaning to it? And I don't have an answer now really to it, but this is an inspiration from Wiesław Juszczak, really.
Yeah, I mean, the diaries didn't appear until the 1975, the first volume was published, and they were published over the next 30 years, all edited by Hannah Kirchner. So when she published the novels, the diary record wasn't known. So I'm always a bit wary about using the diary as any way into the novels, because she published the novels, and this is what she deliberately published. This is what she wanted the public to read. It was only later that the diaries, became significant at all. But one thing that I have noticed is how she uses the diaries as part of her technique of writing. Yeah, so she records experience, which then gets reworked, and sometimes it's verbatim. I mean, as with this, I mean, the best example are, what she records in the diary of the survivors of the Armenian genocide that she met in the sanatorium, and she then puts that into the novel, and she does. I've got various places where I identified this. I mean, in Granica there's a lot in Boundary, and sometimes it's many years later, because there are certain parts of Boundary which are set in France. And she, in the 1928, she was on the Riviera in South France, and she records a lot of details, including a visit to the Monaco aquarium. And this description of the aquarium is repeated. It's taken out of the diary and put almost verbatim several years later. And another very good example is her last novel, Knots of Life, Węzły Życia, which describes, the invasion of an imaginary state, which was being invaded, and the final 2 or 3 chapters are almost an exact repeat of her diary entries from the beginning of 1939, when she describes the German bombers bombing Warsaw and the trains on which the civilian population were fleeing also being bombed. And these scenes find their way into the novel some years later. So she obviously used the diary as a way of recording experience as it was happening, so that when she repeated it in the novel, it had that immediacy.
Okay, I see someone entering with more wine, which is always a good sign. But we have a few more. I think we do have 10 minutes left. So what I'd like to... Ursula has been in touch with Teresa Halikowska-Smith, who is a former student of this university, I believe.
Yes.
And she has read a master's thesis written by another former student of the university named Jaga Piątkowska. If you could give us some key points in a couple of minutes, because I want to get to some other questions.
We should say it's about
as
Nałkowska
well.
and Woolf.
And it is about Nałkowska and Woolf, a comparative master's thesis, written here.
That 46 years ago, at this university, a thesis was presented from B.Lit degree at St. Hugh's, which some of you might know is one of the cradles of feminism, or suffragette movement, perhaps it's a sleight of hand, suffragettes, those of you who saw the film. And maybe that made this friend of mine, who came a successor on the same scholarship that I came to Oxford in '66, and she came 2 years after me and presented a thesis on a comparative literature, the title of which is Some English and Polish Women Novelists in the Interwar period. She concentrates in it very, very much on the two figures that we've discussed here, except she, as Magda will confirm, because Magda was taught both history and British Life and Institution course, that this friend, Jaga Piątkowska, taught at Kraków University a few years later after producing this. So her point, she very much analyzes this from, and before the second wave of feminism of the 90s in Poland. So this thesis was presented in 1969. And this, she absolutely every single theme, except for the theme of translation, because that was not the history of. So let me just read you the list of contents, and those of you who are interested can look at the thesis at the Bodleian Library, because as you know, every thesis has to be deposited there. So the list of contents: Emancipation of Women in Polish Life and Literature. Chapter number 2, Feminist Thought in England. Third chapter, Writers and Society. Fourth, Writers and Politics. Then she talks about the number 5, the adolescent and the adult novel. This is the one thing that didn't come to your discussion, that many feminist or women's book novels were about growing up, about initiation.
Kobiety. Well, Kobiety was about that.
Absolutely. And the last is Women in Love, and that deals with the sexual rights, with the depiction of sex in both literatures. I think if anybody had any doubt about the value of comparative approach to literature, I think this thesis would put a very strong case how important it is to see it from many points of view. For example, the history of Polish women didn't have to chain themselves to anything because they got voting rights straight away after the Polish state gained independence.
But men
so
didn't have the rights either.
To fight about political rights, but of course they did have to fight about many other issues of social equality, the sexual equality.
Women straight away with us.
Yes, it did. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. That's absolutely
if I may just respond to that.
And I can give you full details of the thesis which can be read.
I did some research on academic writing about Virginia Woolf in Polish academia, and indeed Jaga Piątkowska wrote about her also and published her essays on Woolf in Poland. Not this aspect.
Because her own daughter, they couldn't find the thesis, and
but this is not the same text. I know. I talked to her daughter as well, and she said the mum's papers are in the attic, and it's so cold and dark here that only only if you really want me to go, I can go. But the other essay by Jaga Piątkowska is on the feminist pamphlets, as she says, of Virginia Woolf. Interestingly, what she says is that Woolf's political diagnosis was erroneous and confused. 3 Guineas being an old and irritational essay, testimony of the author's anguish rather than a sample of coherent writing.
Now, in her thesis, she quotes this lovely quote of Leonard, her husband, who says, "Virginia is not a political animal."
And I think this is really an enhanced. Sorry.
How did you put it? Was completely uninterested in politics since the time when Aristotle formulated this phrase,
the concept,
like this concept of political animal.
Can I? Sorry to cut this short, Anna, but I do want to see if there are some. If we can get some more questions from the audience here. We've got a lot of students here, perhaps, who maybe have some questions to ask. Or anything else about Woolf? Nikolai, you have a question.
No, he was just checking time.
I was just checking time, and I would simply propose that we continue the discussion
over a glass of wine.
Over a glass of wine.
Okay, I will bow to the convener of the program on modern Poland. So thank you very much to all of you for coming along this evening with some competition in the event schedule. So we're very appreciative, and please show your thanks to Magda Heydel and Ursula Phillips.
Thank you very much.